Hello, world! Welcome, programmers! Welcome, music lovers! Welcome to Coda! How's it going? We are streaming live from Boston, Massachusetts this evening, July 12th, 2020. It is a hot one. Sweating. Well, thanks again for joining Coda this evening. My name is Joseph Parzell. I'm your host. Of course, we have Eric Gaudet on guitar. Here we go. This is our abstract for season 1. We are currently in episode number 6. Today we will begin to discuss Graph. That's a Microsoft Graph. This is part 1. The technical specification for today's episode, of course, like every week, we will do a quick introduction to Code and Coda. And then after the introduction, we will do a recap of last week's episode in less than 5 minutes. After that, for this week, we are going to connect our Alexa skill to Office 365. That will allow us to access Microsoft Graph from our skill. So, without further ado, here we go. Quick introduction to Code and Coda. You've been here before, so you know this already. This was a Teams Thursday presentation. And so I took the slides from my Teams Thursday presentation, asked my friend Eric if he would play some music while I present these slides online, and here we are in week 6, episode 6 of Code and Coda. It's going pretty good. Hope you are enjoying it. Don't forget, before we get started, maybe it would be a good idea to turn off or mute the microphone on your Amazon Alexa device. Speaking of, Alexa, how are you?
I'm feeling like a whiz, so if you'd like a challenge, ask me for a quiz.
No thanks. Not tonight, Alexa. Sorry. She said, I'm feeling like a whiz, so ask me for a quiz. Well, she's also feeling like a poet. I don't know if she knows it. Alexa, what's the weather tonight?
This evening, you can look for partly cloudy skies, with temperatures around 76 degrees Fahrenheit. By the way, you can also ask me questions about sunrise and sunset times. Try asking, what time is sunset?
Yes, I know this information already, because I do ask about the sunrise and sunset. Some other astrological events that are happening these days. Don't forget to check out the comet that's flying past our blue planet. It's not far away. You can see it without binoculars. Take a look near the Big Dipper. All right, everybody have their Alexa device muted. Let's get into this recap from last week. Last week's episode was episode 5, the second half of the response topic. We continued work on our asynchronous functions within our C# web application and utilized the access token that Alexa sends us in the request. And to make sending a response easier, we created a new class in C#, and then we created a custom intent for our skill, which failed. Now, I know I said last week that we would get back to that, but this week I've actually decided to switch gears just a little bit, and we won't be doing so much code in this episode. We'll be taking a strong look at Microsoft Graph and pretty much everything that you need to do involving Microsoft Graph besides the code. We'll get to that in about 5 minutes, but for now, let's see if we can go ahead and run through last week's slides in less than 5 minutes. So, with the help of our friend Alexa, please set timer for 5 minutes.
5 minutes, starting now.
Alright, I hope I don't get too hot doing this. Here we go. So, we looked at the Amazon API endpoint that we are sent in the request. We also have a second half of that endpoint, which is the API URL, and that's specific to the information that we want to receive. In this case, we were trying to get the time zone of the device. So we updated our getGreeting function in C#, added those URLs to our methods, and then parsed the data that came back. Now remember, the API endpoint is sent to us from Alexa, but not everything is. In our C# web application, we went in back to our getGreeting function. You can see what it looked like before we put any of those pieces of information in there. In our C# app, we also created some global variables here. These are the values that we're getting from the request. How do we set those values in the request? Well, we go back to our index part of our home controller. We cleaned up some of the data checking that we were doing, and then we went ahead and parsed the JSON so that we could get the data that we were looking for, like API endpoint, the access token, and the device ID. We tried to run our application by giving it a fake access token, and when we did that, we got an unauthorized response. So where do we get the correct access token from? Well, we can just go back to the testing console, run the Coda invocation, which will generate a request, and that's how we get our access token. So once we put in the correct access token, we get a status of 200, which means everything went good. Now you can see what we did to send that request to the Amazon Alexa API. We send the API endpoint along with the access token. In the next part of our episode, we created a new class in C#, and so in this new class, and before we get to that part, we just right here can see that the API is sending back the time zone that the device is in. And after building and running our invocation, you can see that the time zone is sent. If you want to further customize that time zone, here are the classes that you should look into. Now, creating that new class. Here we are in our project in the models folder, and we created a new class called Alexa Post Response. And within that class,
To send and receive messages, first register in your Alexa app.
I thought I had muted her. So, where were we? Who knows? Let's keep going. In our HTML page, the goal was to take out this hard-coded text and put the JSON object in its place. And so this is the object that we're creating, the Alexa Post Response. You can see here are the fields and sub-objects. So once we do that, we come back to our index, we create an Alexa Post Response object and set all of those fields. And after going through all of that, we can see in our new SSML formatted response, we are giving it an emotion. back to the Alexa developer console, we created a custom intent, and that was so that we could know when the user wanted specific information before we got to that part. However, I quickly went and showed you how to submit that JSON object to the UI layer once that object has all of its data. Rather than hardcode that data, we just send the entire object to the UI layer. We ran the project, put in an access token, and ran it. And there's our response. We published our app, came to the developer console, and the Amazon developer console went and created a custom intent called Get Teams. After we created the intent, I'm almost done, Alexa. Alexa, stop. And after we built our custom skill and tried to run that new custom intent, we got an error. And I've been working on figuring out why this was giving us an error. Could not figure it out quite yet, but that's okay because today we are going to look at Microsoft Graph and Graph Explorer. And that is the end of our recap. Just about 5 minutes. How about we take another quick peek in at Eric before we start part 1. Here's what we're going to take a look at for part 1. We're going to open up our web browser and take a gander at Microsoft Graph Explorer. This is a web application that Microsoft has published. Easily findable in Google, or I suppose Microsoft would prefer I say Bing, but who uses that? Here we go. Microsoft Graph Explorer. What am I talking about here? Well, here's the web application. You can see I am at developer.microsoft.com with a little bit more after that. When you first come to the page, you see this little authentication section. So of course, you are required to sign in. And what we are doing is signing in with our Office 365 account. So if you have an Office 365 account, go ahead and log in with that. Feel free to send me an email now that you know my email address. And after you log in, you can see your profile picture shows up. Look how short my hair was. I think that picture is about 10 years old. I probably should update that. And by default, when we first come to the page, you can see this toolbar at the top is giving us the option to request specific information. So here is the example endpoint for Microsoft Graph when you need to get information about me, yourself, the user that is currently logged in. And you can see over here on the left-hand side is some navigation. Now that first button, My Profile, that's the /me. All of these buttons over here on the left-hand side in this navigation, and we'll see more in just a second, are the various endpoints and types of information that you can request from Microsoft Graph. Well, what information are we looking for? I've collapsed the Getting Started tree there, and you can see here there are two options for Microsoft Teams. One is Microsoft Teams and the other Microsoft Teams Beta. You can use both of these options. We're actually going to be using some endpoints from each. And what this means is that the endpoints that are in beta are currently not production ready, but for the most part they are. Before we look at the other endpoints for Teams, this is what you get when you click on the button for the /me endpoint. You can see the data that's returned. So once again, here at the top, our toolbar, I have the endpoint, and then after clicking on Run Query here at the top, you can see the response. So it's very similar to how Alexa is working with your web application. A request is sent and a response is given. So in this response, you can see in this JSON data some information about the user that's currently logged in. That's great, but what we are interested in is data from Microsoft Teams. So if I expand the Microsoft Teams tree, you can see some of the options that are available. The first one there, My Joined Teams, is going to give you a list of teams that you are a member of. So, in our web application, one of the things we're going to do is use this endpoint, the /me/joined teams endpoint, to ask Microsoft Graph for some data. We'll get a response. This is the response that we'll get. And within our web application, we will parse the data that we get back from Microsoft Graph. And you can see here, here's part of the data that's returned. When I ask Microsoft Graph what teams I've joined, Code and Coda is a team that comes up as a result. You can see the display name and the description there for the team. The ID is also a very important piece of information. I've X'd out a lot of that ID value, but we will use the ID to get other information about the team, like the messages and the channels. In order to view this information from Microsoft Graph, from this Graph Explorer, you need to consent to certain permissions. Now, within our web application, we are going to have the user consent to permissions during the linking workflow. For Microsoft Graph, the way that you consent to permissions is by clicking on that little gear there and select permissions. When you do that, in this little window pane over here, you can navigate through all of the permission types. There are a lot. Which permission levels or scopes do we need for our web application? Well, we need 4. When you require these scopes, and when the user consents to these scope levels, then you are able to do things like obtain a list of joint teams and get the messages and all of that. So if we wanted to add one of these scopes to the Microsoft Graph permissions, what we're doing here is we're telling, the Microsoft Graph Explorer permissions. There is a difference. What we're using is Microsoft Graph Explorer to access data from our account. Microsoft Graph Explorer uses Microsoft Graph to retrieve that data. So we need to consent to permissions for Microsoft Graph Explorer in order for Microsoft Graph Explorer to retrieve that data. Now, here you can see group.read.all. I have not consented to that permission level. If you remember from one slide ago, group.read.all is necessary to read messages within a group. So before I go ahead and click on that consent button, let's see what happens when you have not consented. First, we need to build our URL for this Microsoft Graph API request. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to again run the joined teams query to get back some data. Within the joined teams, the data that's returned is the ID for the team. And we're going to take that ID and we're going to use that to run this endpoint called messages. Let's see what that looks like. Alright. So up here you can see that the URL has changed just a little bit because now this messages endpoint has only been approved for beta use. Now there are some other pieces of information that we need to place within this endpoint. You can see right there. The group ID is necessary to retrieve messages from a team. Also, the channel ID is necessary. So it's somewhat of a 3-step process. Could be 2 steps, but what you're going to do is run these 3 commands in order to get your messages. So once we get the data returned from the join teams API, we can use the group ID to then get a channel ID. So we use the team ID to get a list of channels. Once we get the list of channels, we use the channel ID to get the messages. When I try to do that without consenting, now up here I've changed the URL so that we don't have any IDs, but what I've done is I've placed this full entire URL into there. Oop, my mistake, take one step back. We are only on the second part here. We're getting the channels first using the team ID. So when we run the channels endpoint, you can see the data that is returned There's a channel ID that's returned. The display name for the channel, which is general, you've probably seen that word before in regards to channel names and Microsoft Teams, because that is the default channel that is created for every team. So our list of channels that's returned, we only get one channel back, and when we try to use all of that information finally together, we put in our team ID and our channel ID with the word messages at the end. And you can see it's forbidden. We have not consented to that scope. So we will consent to that scope next in part 2. After we consent to that scope in Microsoft Graph Explorer, we will then create a new public application in Microsoft Azure. We'll be right back for that. Hang in there. Let's check out Eric for a minute. Okay, here we go with the next part of episode 6 of Code and Coda. Thanks again for joining us. Don't forget, YouTube chat is open. So if you want to say hi, if you have any questions, send us a chat in YouTube and I will do my best to respond live. Cheers. So to create this custom public app in Microsoft Azure, well, we are doing this because our web application that is being called by the Alexa skill needs to access Office 365. In order to do that, we create sort of a gateway for the user to provide us credentials and to consent to the scopes that we require. This process is facilitated by this Microsoft Azure public application. Before we get to Azure, let's take another peek back at what we finished off with from the last part. Remember, the permissions for Microsoft Graph Explorer need to be consented to as well. So what I'm doing in Microsoft Graph Explorer is I've searched for the scope group.read.all, and once I find that scope, which will allow me to read messages from a team, I consent. You get a little pop-up window that asks if you would like to consent to this permission request, and you can see read all groups. It allows you to access a little bit more than just than messages. You also have the option to consent on behalf of your organization, which means nobody else would have to consent to this permission in your tenant. You could do it for everybody else. Once you consent, you see under the status column the word consented. And then when I run my beta endpoint for teams/channel/messages, here is the response I get. And this is actually data from the Coda team. And you can see there's a message here from May 22nd. Along with the message create date, you can also, of course, get the message contents, who it's from. You can see that this message was from me, the body of the message from Teams. And you can see I sent a message to Eric, and I added the @ symbol. I added him to the message. So you can see in the JSON data that's sent back, sort of with tags that designate that I tagged Eric, letting him know that I created a bunch of tasks for Coda because we were going to start in about a week. So when you submit your API endpoint request to Microsoft Graph using the URL, that's the data that you get in return. Stay with me here. We are now in Microsoft Azure. What I've done is I've gone to the Azure portal. Within the Azure portal, I clicked on Azure Active Directory and then app registrations. Now these are all of the custom apps that you have created in your Azure service. I have a few apps already registered in my portal. Those have been blocked out. But what we're going to do is click on the new registration button so we can create a new custom app in Azure. A couple more button clicks, give it a name, Alexa skill, and what we have done is we're saying, rather than the default first option, which is creating a skill for only your tenant, we're creating a skill that allows any user to come in and access this skill. So anybody with an Office 365 account would be able to use this skill. Click on register at the bottom, and after you do so, you are brought to the overview tab of the new app in Microsoft Azure. Some basic information about your app, such as the application ID, is here. You can also click on this button here called Endpoints, and this is very important for later. We can take a quick look first. These endpoints are locations that we need to place within our Alexa skill so that our skill knows where to go to authorize the user that's logging into the app. So when our skill asks the user for their username and password, what they're really doing is showing a web page, and this is the web page that's being shown. It's basically a secure way for a user to log into a custom app without having to give the custom app a username and password. You're not really giving the custom app your username and password, you're logging into this location, and in this case it's a microsoftonline.com website. And after you log in, this website in turn provides things like access tokens to the custom app rather than your password. The next thing you might want to do here is click on the Certificates and Secrets tab. We need to create a client secret, and this is going to allow us to safely connect our Alexa skill and our web application to this custom Azure app. When you create this new client secret, give it any old description, and I choose to have it expire never. This way you don't have to worry about creating any secrets in the future, but that's all dependent on your security structure. After you create the client secret, it'll show up at the bottom. And at this point, it's probably a good idea to copy the secret, because once you navigate away from this tab, when you come back, you will no longer be able to see the secret. Basically, if you navigate away and you lose the secret, you need to create a new one. No big deal. I do it all the time. Well, what permissions does our custom app in Azure need from Microsoft Graph? Well, we can click on the API permissions. You can see by default, we are given the permission level of user.read, but remember, we need 4 scopes, 4 different types of permissions. So what we can do is click on add a permission. And hey, great, there's Microsoft Graph right there at the top. We are going to add some Microsoft Graph scopes. So once we click on that, the next tab you see here, we are going to make sure that delegated permissions has been selected. This means that we want the app to run with the identity of the user that's logged in, not with application permissions or something like a user service account. Once you have clicked on delegated permissions, you can start searching for the scopes that you need to have associated with your Azure application. There you can see group.read.all is there, so I've checked that off. Once you find all 4, add all 4 of those scopes to your Azure application. Should all be listed there. And once you create your Azure application, the next thing to do is to tell your Alexa skill how to connect to that Azure application. And that Azure application is going to allow our Alexa skill to access Microsoft Graph. So let's take a look at the Alexa Developer Console next. Before we do that, we'll take a quick look back in and see how Eric is doing. Sounded like we might have had a little hiccup there in our sound. Again, we are using StreamYard for sound this evening. We are using StreamYard for this episode. We used it for the last episode. I've noticed that the sound quality is much better using StreamYard, but there are a couple of hiccups that I've noticed every now and then, most likely because StreamYard is a web application-based service, whereas Teams is a client and a web application-based service. When you use the client application, sometimes you get better quality. Eric, what's going on, my man? You know, we really do have a lot of fun with Code and Coda. It's basically just another reason for me and Eric to hang out. And of course, we get to hang out with everybody who's watching tonight. Thanks again for joining. We only have a few more slides. We're gonna try and get through these last slides quickly. Excuse me. Excuse my grammar. Alright, well, we are back on our Alexa Developer Console. I've clicked on the Models tab. Once you click on the Models tab, you can click on the Account Linking tab. This is going to let our Alexa skill know that we need to link up to an external service. That external service is our application in Azure. So, account linking, we're going to go ahead and switch that on. Now, to get our data, here we are back in our Azure portal. This is where you get all of the data for the dashboard. So I probably should have shown you down here first. This is the security provider information section. It's asking for an authorization URI, an access token URI, your client ID, and your secret. So the client ID is our app ID in Azure. Our secret is the client secret that we generated. And the two URLs that we're going to be putting in there, you can find those when you go back to your Alexa skill in Azure. A whole mess of URLs here to choose from. Well, we want the OAuth 2.0 URLs, of course. Once we get the authorization endpoint and the token endpoint, we'll get the application ID from the Overview tab, and then the client secret from the Certificates and Secrets tab. Well, you can't get the old one, so you create a new one. Here it is with all the information back in our skill. The next thing to do will be to add some scopes to your account linking. These are the 4 scopes we keep referring back to. And save button at the top. Here we go. Our changes have been saved. So, we have successfully gone through Microsoft Graph Explorer. We can see now that we can use Graph Explorer to get information about the user, to get information about teams, get a lot of different information. After we checked out Graph Explorer, we went ahead and created an Azure app that we are allowing external users to use. We got all of our app information, like the app ID, the client secret, and the URLs, placed it into our Alexa skill in the account linking section. The next step will be to actually link your skill for real to Office 365, but unfortunately we don't have time for that tonight. We are pretty much at our limit. So thanks again for being with us tonight. Next week, episode 7. We have 2 more episodes in Code and Coda. We have next week, we'll finish our graph episode. We'll actually link our account from our phone and the Alexa app on our phone to Office 365, and this way our Alexa skill will now get a Microsoft Graph API access token. Once we have that access token, we can get all of the information we need from Microsoft Graph, and we can finally retrieve all of that lovely data, parse through that data, write some more C#. I hope you come back next week. We got next week's episode, we'll finish up some Microsoft Graph, and then the season finale, we'll wrap it all up. Thanks again. This is Code and Coda, signing off. Keep cool out there. Join us again Sunday evenings. Doors open 9:15. I'm getting hot.